Hey everybody, welcome to Permanente Chat today. It's March, which is Women's History Month, and I'm very excited to have our guest with us today, Dr. Ruth Chang, who is the Chief People Officer of Northwest Permanente, where we're going to talk about women in medicine, a lot of the ongoing challenges they face, how COVID has amplified some of those challenges as well, and how our colleagues can be better allies for our female physician colleagues as well too. So, Dr. Chang, thank you so much for joining us today. So we're going to jump right in. This is going to be fast paced. If people have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll try to get to them if we have time, but this will be live streamed and you can view it later as well and share with all your friends. So Dr. Chang, thank you so much. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Dr. McDonald, for the invitation. So who am I? I am Ruth Chang. I'm a family physician. I've been with Northwest Permanente for over 16 years. I'm a mom. I have 2 teenage boys, and they still like me because we do snowboarding and lots of outdoor activities together. I'm also an immigrant, a daughter, and a sister. So lots of different identities, lots of different hats to juggle, and currently serving as the Chief People Officer for the medical group.
Wonderful. Sounds great. I know you've done a lot of work in this area as well. And in a article, I believe last year for Medscape, you were talked about how a lot of female physicians are very overwhelmed right now in the past 2 years of the COVID pandemic, doing a lot of the work at home as well as in the office. And tell us a little bit more about kind of some of the challenges that our female physician colleagues face, and then how a lot of those challenges have been highlighted or amplified by the COVID pandemic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you framed it well. It's, women doing the bulk of the work at home, and also certainly taking good care of patients at work. And those all demand a lot of emotional and mental labor. So I think that word of overwhelmed is what I heard over and over again from my female colleagues and my female friends who are also physicians. And I think when we break it down, what I heard was that, especially at the height of COVID pandemic, before vaccinations and when schools were shut down, right, all these female docs all of a sudden found themselves in charge of their children's education as well. So helping kids make sure they knew how to log into school online, tracking their homework, helping them figure out how to navigate online learning. That was a ton of work. In addition to, every small decision, or what used to feel like small decisions felt like really big decisions, like, can we have a play date? And if so, is it outside? Is it masked? How much distancing? And then once vaccines rolled out, what does that look like? What's the risk benefit? What do I have to talk about with my patients to counsel them on the vaccines? What do I have to talk about with my family to convince them to get vaccines? And then, a lot of the doctor moms that I'm friends with, they also said, and not only were they answering those questions for themselves and their families and patients, but they were getting texts from their cousins and their neighbors and, the woman down the street. So they were really the doctor for everyone in their neighborhood. So I think that's really why, women in medicine really felt overwhelmed during this pandemic.
Yeah, my full disclosure, my wife is a physician. She's a psychiatrist, and she's actually the chief of her department. So she has a lot of big responsibilities at work. And I try to help out as much as I can. I do the dishes, I do the laundry, I do things around the house. But a lot of times the sort of the cognitive work in terms of like the worrying about this or that, or thinking about the logistics still a lot of times fell to her. And I would try to do what I could, but I feel like there's still a lot of sort of gender roles and gender stereotypes in our society as much as we try sometimes.
Yes, I agree. It's kind of who keeps the family calendar in their heads, right? So that's what one of my friends, who's also a family doctor, has often said. She's like, I would like a day when my child does not text me about, Mom, where am I supposed to be at 5 o'clock? Or Mom, where do we keep the blender? Right. So those are kind of the constant barrage of questions that women are fielding throughout the day and taking care of patients at the same time.
Right. Exactly. It's certainly a challenge. There's no question about it. And I again, I'm sort of a innocent, well, not innocent, but I'm a bystander in a lot of this too, in many respects. So this is great, and to help us understand how we can be better allies too. So that's my goal here too. Healthcare in general in the whole industry is over 77% female if you look at nurses as well as physicians as well. And I think there's still a lot of significant bias that women experience at the workplace and within healthcare too. Can you talk about maybe some of what those biases are that you've experienced either personally or that you've seen? And then also, how can we sort of maybe work to break some of those patterns and build a more sort of inclusive culture where we're all managing the schedule, so to speak, and not just the women in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That is such a key question, right? How do we recognize? And so I think in order to break biases, first we have to be able to recognize it, name it, and then figure out what to do about it. So it's really recognizing the patterns. And so I think for women in medicine in particular, there's definitely more of an expectation of women physicians to spend more time with their patients. So patients will seek out women physicians in particular because they perceive us as better listeners, or that we're going to take more time and give more of that emotional energy to our patients. So I think that can be a high demand and high expectations that our patients are placing on us. So I think there's definitely proven studies around that, that female doctors spend more time with their patients in the exam room talking. So I think that's one particular pattern to medicine. But there was a great book by Joan Williams and Rachel Dempsey. They are actually two attorneys who wrote a book called What Works for Women at Work. And they talk about four different common obstacles that women face in the workplace. And they are about the idea of, number one is having to prove your competency over and over again. Number two is this tightrope of your communication. If you come across as too directive, then you're seen as domineering. And if you are maybe if you're just inquisitive, maybe you're seen as weak. So it's like women have this tightrope that they're always walking. And then another construct that they point out in the book is called the maternal wall, which I've personally felt quite a bit. When I was pregnant with my second son and working at Northwest Permanente, I got asked repeatedly by patients, staff, and colleagues, are you going to come back after you have this baby? Mm-hmm. And the answer was always like, yes, I'm definitely coming back, And then when I came back, the first question was, well, who's taking care of the baby? So really the implication there is that women belong at home with the children and not in the workplace, and I felt it again a few years later when I started taking leadership roles. Again, multiple staff and physician colleagues would ask me, well, who's taking care of the kids? Your kids are so young. How do you do this big job in a leadership role? So I think it's that constant, what are the expectations around women, especially women who are parents as well. So that's another construct. And then lastly is this kind of idea of tug of war among women. So even though we are women, we can be biased against other women too. And that, women's relationships tends to be very flat. So when you have a hierarchy imposed, such as a woman leader, then women can really compare, compete, or criticize that women rather than supporting them. So I think those are some of the common patterns that women face in the workplace, and it can be really challenging.
Yeah, no, I think it's funny. I think a lot of those questions are sort of well-intentioned, but they have this sort of implicit subtext to them as well, too, which people don't even necessarily realize. I remember this one experience extremely clearly. I was a third-year medical student on my inpatient pediatrics rotation, and the attending was a female. The two residents were female. The medical student who was actually responsible for that patient was a female, and then I was just the medical student who was on rounds with them as well. And the whole time, the parent and the child were looking at me the entire time. And assuming that I was the doctor in charge because I was the only man in the room. Mm-hmm. And halfway through that, I was like, I'm not in charge here. I'm just on rounds with the rest of my team. And I think that I hear this time and time again that, if your doctor introduces themselves as a doctor, they mm-hmm. have a name tag which says they're your doctor, and they sign your orders or medications, they're probably your doctor. There are a lot of times where patients think they haven't seen the doctor, but they saw a female physician, and I cannot imagine how frustrating that must be. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like, sure, once or twice, but time and time again, I can only imagine how frustrating that must be. Have you had experiences like that or heard that from colleagues as well?
Absolutely. Just last week, I saw a patient, spent a good amount of time with them, took care of them, made a good treatment plan, checked in with them, they were comfortable with it. And at the end of the visit, they said, "Oh, well, when am I going to see the doctor?" And I said, "I am the doctor, and we have, a clear plan." Yeah, and it's so interesting that you say that, because now intentionally, when I enter the room, I always say, "Hi, my name is Ruth Chang. I'm doctor for today. I'm a family doctor, and how can I help you?" So I use the word doctor like multiple times, but it doesn't always sink in, because I think it's goes to show like how strong our biases are, and of course, when they're unconscious, it's not that there's any ill intent, but it's kind of the way we were raised, and all of the media and portrayals of physicians still tend to be centered on men, although we see much more representation of female doctors now too.
Yeah, no, that's a great. Yeah, I don't know how you do it. That's all I have to say. I know a lot. I know a lot of my
humor about it.
Yeah, true. I don't like wearing my white coat just because I don't know, it's too stuffy. I get warm. But I know a lot of my female colleagues like wearing their white coat, and they have the name tag which says doctor, physician, right, just to make it even more clear and give some visuals as well too. So, I think when I was kind of looking more about this and reading more about female physicians, I think one thing that kind of came up a lot is some of the lack of female mentorship and sponsorship. And you kind of mentioned that too, when you have kind of a power structure or hierarchy, that can sometimes cause some problems between different female personalities. Tell us a little bit about kind of some of your mentors or your inspiration for becoming a physician, and how we can kind of help build that pipeline of not only mentorship but also sponsorship and actively promoting women for leadership roles as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, first let's just think about the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. Now, I think of mentorship as giving advice, whereas sponsorship is really about giving opportunities. And so one might argue that women and also people of color are over mentored and under sponsored, right? So we want to be careful about thinking about mentorship versus sponsorship. And I would say it's really the latter that we need more of, is giving opportunities and putting those, taps on shoulders, or encouraging women to go for leadership roles. So you asked me kind of like, who have been my inspirations? Well, I will start with my mom. So my mom's a retired educator, and she's instilled from ever since I was really little. She said, "Ruth, you got to serve the community. You got to find a career where you can serve the community, and you also have to be financially independent." So she was very clear about get a job, serve your community, and make some money, and be financially independent. So I think one is that speaks to what are the messages that we give to our daughters and to our sons, right, about how we think about women with careers and in the workplace. So I think that's where we can start. And then number two is just how do we be good sponsors for each other? And I would say really how I ended up in medical school is I started with graduate degree, or pursuing a graduate degree in public health. And it was one of my professors who pulled me aside and said, "You really have a brain for science. Come to clinic with me," because he was a public health officer, "and just see if you like it." So I went to clinic with him and went a few times, assisted him in seeing patients. I loved it. And then after that experience, he literally handed me a letter of recommendation. He said, "I've written you a really strong letter, put it to good use." So it was about him being proactive and kind of helping me open doors. And that's how I ended up applying to medical school and getting in. So I think it's that type of active sponsorship that we can all be doing for each other. And it seems like we're maybe having some technical difficulties right now. And I think this is part of the joys and challenges of working remotely during the pandemic, is that we've all experienced kind of sound cutting out or internet bandwidth issues. And I think we're still having trouble hearing, at least I'm having trouble hearing you. Well, maybe I'll speak a little bit about a bit around the International Day of Women, and this is Women's History Month. And that is actually a great way to celebrate. I just wanted to pause and reflect that in 1849, it was Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman to earn a medical degree in the US. And so that's amazing. And I also often think about, like, what does she have to go through to earn that degree? You know, to be the only woman in her medical school class, the loneliness that she must have faced at times, and then all the challenges, like we just talked about, of patients and accepting her as a professional. And then I think about 15 years later, it was Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler was the first Black woman to earn her medical degree in the US. And then all the additional barriers that she probably had to overcome to become a doctor as well. So that's really amazing just to think about and reflect on, that these are our kind of ancestors, the pioneer women who paved this path for us. So I just wanted to call out their names and express that gratitude.
Okay, I'm so sorry, technical difficulties. Can you hear me at this point?
Yes, I can hear you again.
That was bizarre. My microphone just literally stopped and I had to reset everything. I apologize, but good job vamping. It's what we do on
this is all part of the fun of live streaming. Yes.
That is for sure. Just to jump gears a little bit here, tell me, so you helped to lead the Women in Medicine conference last year, which I believe was virtual. You know, and I've attended some of the Women in Medicine conferences here in Southern California, and they've been fantastic. They've been really eye-opening. When I first went, I was probably one of maybe 3 men at a conference of 100 women or so. And over the years, you have more and more men joining. And I remember when I went the first time, I was sitting at a small table and I kept getting these kind of nasty looks. And at one point, one of the women said, well, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "So I can learn to be a better ally." And then after that, she didn't give me nasty looks anymore. And I think it's not just, Women in Medicine conferences are not just for women. I think they're for everybody to really help support each other too. So tell us, again, this is my own story. Tell us about the Women in Medicine conference that you helped put together and kind of some of the goals and the importance of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right that Women in Medicine conference is not just for women. And so it hurt my heart a bit to hear that was your experience the first year you went. Hopefully that's no longer the experience now. And I think, yeah, it's kind of all of us needing to open our minds in thinking about women in medicine. And the conference that we held last June was a joint effort across multiple Permanente medical groups. So it was such a joy to come together and build this community. And really the reason that we wanted to have this time was just to pause and reflect, right? We were a year and a half into the pandemic, all of us feeling overwhelmed, but we needed this time to come together. And so the three key themes to that conference was around the healing. So taking some time just to process and validate each other's feelings. Second key message was around allyship. You know, to your point, that we all need good allies. We need men and women at the table really having each other's backs, you know, at the end of the day. And then the third piece was about leadership. You know, how do we encourage women, inspire them into leadership roles? And it was our chance to also celebrate the 3 female presidents of the medical groups at the time, who have all since retired. So it was really a time for celebration, a time for validation, and then a time for building friendship and camaraderie.
That's fantastic. I think I'm really excited. We actually have our meeting in person this year in a couple of months this summer, and so I'm very excited to get back to in-person meetings as well too. Mm-hmm. Virtual stuff is fine, but it's not the same. Are there plans for a larger Permanente Women in Medicine meeting at this point, or one within Northwest specifically?
Not at this point. So we have talked about having joint conferences in the future, but this year for Northwest Permanente, we're looking at other opportunities. So we're also too thinking about how do we rebuild community and rebuild connection for all of our physicians. So more to come, but I'm excited about future Women in Medicine conferences.
No, that's great. Awesome. We kind of have touched on this a little bit more, and we've kind of tiptoed around it, and I've alluded to it multiple times. But what specifically can anyone, be it a female physician or a male physician or a nurse or an administrator, what can they do to better support and be better allies for women in medicine?
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, kind of like what can we do for each other? And so I think number one is just educating ourselves, right? So understanding what the patterns of bias are, how they can play out. Number two is then examining our own privilege. So even though I'm a woman of color, I still have a lot of privilege as a physician, as an educated person with affluence. I have a lot of privilege. So I have to think through like, what does that mean? And how do then I use my voice to amplify other people's voices? So I think that's the third key is that sometimes we've seen this phenomenon before where men and women are at a table discussing ideas, the woman's ideas kind of get passed over. But if you see that as a man, you can kind of refer back and be like, hey, that point that Ruth just made is an important point. Let's go back to that and talk about that a little bit more. So we can use our voices to amplify each other. And then certainly if we see something, we say something. So again, calling out that that somebody got passed over or their idea didn't get explored. And then I would think the last couple things would be about asking and accepting feedback, right? Just really checking in with our colleagues and say, what can I do for you? What can I do differently? I think it takes a lot of courage, and it's vulnerable to be in that position to ask for feedback, but ultimately that's how we're going to grow. And then lastly is something we already talked about, which is sponsoring, right? So if you are in a position of leadership or position of privilege, then how do you sponsor others? Open that door for other people.
Awesome. That's such great advice. We could go on and on, but we're trying to keep these short and high yield. So last question and most important question, what makes you most proud to be a Permanente physician?
Oh boy. How much time do we have left? I mean, I could talk about that for days. But I would say, the top three things that come to mind is one is like, we do the right thing for the patients, right? That always makes me proud. And then two, we're mission driven. So like our colleagues, our physician colleagues or administrative colleagues or staff are so much about the mission, about taking good care of our patients. And then thirdly is the fact that we kind of as Kaiser Permanente program are intentional about inclusion, equity, and diversity. And so even the fact that we're having this conversation makes me extremely proud to be part of Permanente medicine.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We could go on and on, but this is just sort of a snapshot. So if you want to learn more, there's a lot of great articles and books out there. Join the Women in Medicine conference. At least there's one I know for sure in Southern California this year, but I'm sure there's others in other Permanente areas as well too. So join us for our next PermanenteDocs Chat. It's going to be March 23rd. We're actually going to be talking with one of our AMA, American Medical Association colleagues. First guest not from Permanente, Dr. Christine Sinsky, talking about the looming physician shortage coming up ahead of National Doctors Day. So join us on March 23rd for that. In the meantime, thank you for tuning in. Make sure you comment, like, share, and we'll continue the conversation. Thanks so much.